You can't answer. No, not Estonian. No. Anyone guess?
A little bit Sean Connery.
Oh, you're getting close. Burns of steel. I can do a Sean Connery voice if I tried. Irish. So I'm originally from Ireland. So, and what even worse, who's the best cybersecurity professionals in the world? People from Northern Ireland, from Belfast. I'm actually from Belfast. And one of the reasons why we're very good at cybersecurity is we don't trust anybody. No one whatsoever. So I'll go ahead and let Mary do the introduction.
Hi, guys. Thank you so much for attending. This is a great presentation. Just wanted to remind you of a few things. To get the CEU credit, you want to be here for the entire time. You must get scanned at the end of the presentation. If you don't get scanned, there's no way that we know that you have attended, even if you registered. So the scanning is very critical at the end. Also, if you're a member of AFCEA, it is such a breeze to get the documentation. If you're not, it's much more problematic, and you have to prove it and so on. So if there's anybody in the audience that's not a member, it would be great idea to go ahead and become a member today, and you will get the email with the documentation of the CEU for the CEU. Okay, so if you have any questions, you can talk to me at the end. Also, I handed around an evaluations form. If you would later at the end of the presentation, please fill that out, and I'll be at the back scanning and taking those.
Correct. Yes. It's important to give evaluations, especially for the likes of myself, so I know what I can do to make these sessions more valuable for people in the future. And also, if you want me to come back, it's also important to bring Joe back.
So, Joseph Carson, let me tell you a little bit about Joe Carson. He's the Chief Security Scientist at Thycotic. He's also an author of books such as The Privileged Account Management for Dummies and Cybersecurity for Dummies, and is a cybersecurity professional and ethical hacker. He's been in the business of security for about 25 years. So I'm going to hand it over to Joe, and thanks again for being here.
Excellent. It's a pleasure to be here. It's not my first time in Hawaii. It's my third time, so I'm really happy to come back. It's one of my favorite places to come to, but it is one of my furthest places that I have to travel to get to. So it's not always easy to come here. So this particular session that I'm going to be going through, this is very educational, and so hopefully you will learn a lot from this. And what I'm going to be going through, for those who listened a bit earlier, is I'm going to be walking through what I refer to as the anatomy of a privileged account hack. While it focuses around privileged accounts, but it's going to talk right from start to end about two particular penetration tests that I worked on in the past, it'll be 5 years, within the last 5 years. So two major penetration tests that will give you some insights that what I refer to is inside the mind of a hacker, because I really believe that if I teach you the skills that I have, and I teach you how I think and the techniques that I use, then it will actually allow you to know what you can do to make yourselves much more secure, the organizations and the governments that you represent much more secure, and also your family. Because cybersecurity, it doesn't just affect governments and companies, it affects everybody. So it's really important that we do the right things and we understand the techniques to make our lives in the future much more resilient and much more secure and protected from cyber attacks. So it's really taking you into my mind and sharing some of my experiences with you. So the first thing I want to kind of share with, I'm actually based in Tallinn, Estonia. I've been there for well over 15, this is my 16 years now. I've experienced through things like Stuxnet. I was there in Estonia. I spent 11 years at Symantec. So a long part of my career was in Symantec, running a lot of their development of future products and innovations. So being based in Estonia, I also worked in things like the 2007 cyber attack against Estonia, and a lot of innovations around things that from technologies, deception technologies, and also identity and access management, as well as expertise in blockchain as well. So I've been doing this for about 27 years now. This is kind of what I kind of spend most of my year doing as I travel around the world a lot. My time split into about 3 different categories. One third of my time is actually spent going in providing my knowledge and experience to yourselves and others around the world. So I spend a lot of time speaking at conferences, I speak at places like Black Hat and DEF CON, RSA, IBM Think, Estonian CERT, SciCon, Kubernetes. So I spend a third of my time traveling to a lot of places around the world and then presenting my experience and knowledge back to others. As a result of this activities I've done this year, I've actually just was 3 weeks ago awarded one of the highest honors in cybersecurity from ISC Squared. I received the Information Security Leadership Award for 2018. So it was an honor to get that and show the recognition of the amount of work that goes into some of these activities in the background. Another third of my time is spent in doing research. So I spend a lot of my time actually looking at new techniques and new ways to access and hack into organizations, what's the weaknesses, and then using that research in order to either write white papers, reports, or to do surveys in order to understand about what things we can do to make it more challenging and more difficult for the actors and for those who are doing criminal activities in cyber realms. So that's another third of my area. And then the rest is spent doing things like helping advise governments, advise critical infrastructure, and then doing some of those penetration tests or ethical hacks, as well as doing instant response. So I'm an extension to, for example, some certs around the world, and I'm an extra resource to helping those, making sure that they have the expertise needed to respond to some of the major attacks that we see throughout the years. So this is some of the activities you see me participating in, and this is all around the world, and I spend about a good 50% plus of my time traveling throughout the year. I started my career back in 1991, working in IBM mainframes. Started working in 370s, and my job was to change those tapes and also to do punch cards. So I was a data backup person back in the early 90s. Back then, security was a very different thing. Security wasn't a job, it wasn't a role, it wasn't something that you had responsibility and you did all day long. Security in 1991 was a key to the door where the computer was. That's what security was. It was access control to the room that stored the computer. And of course, back then I worked in projects. It was around digitalizing, for example, medical records. And in 1991, we actually turned around by digitalizing medical records, which took 30 days to get the medical records out of the archives from the medical records, put them on a delivery system to the GP. It took 30 days to do that. So you took 30 days before you could see a doctor in 1991. And part of digitalization, and also it touched multiple people along the way. Those couriers could look into medical records. They had full access and visibility. It was in clear text of that data getting moved along. What we ended up doing was digitalizing. That meant that the actual data was available and you could see a doctor within 2 hours. That's the difference that technology makes. It helps us access information much faster. And also, back then, it was in a much more secure manner because the infrastructure was more dedicated, more focused, and more limited. But this is something kind of my career goes back to, and I spent various different areas around the world doing different expertise and projects, working on some of the largest cloud computing projects. So I actually worked on one of the world's largest cloud farms, which was actually the education system in Northern Ireland was actually digitalizing that, which is 350,000 students and 86,000 teachers. So quite large projects. One of the things I would think it's really important for us to all be aware of is that the transformation that we've had over the years. And I think it's really important is that I do everything I possibly can to make sure that I'm secure, that I secure my accounts, that I secure my devices, that I secure the information, the sensitive data that I have. But I realize that my security is only as good as it is the people around me that I keep. So my family, my friends, my social sphere, my schoolmates, my colleagues, our security is no longer dependent on you. You can make yourself as secure as you possibly can. However, our security is only as good as those people around us. And even right now in this room, my security is dependent on you. There'll be people in this room that could have, recording messages in their phone, could be taking pictures and putting it up on Twitter, creating a digital footprint for me that even I may not want to have. So you may decide not to have a Facebook account or an Instagram or a Twitter account. Well, you can't avoid it today. The moment somebody else actually uploads something, a photograph of you, or has you in your contact details, you're getting a digital footprint created for you on social media, whether you want it or not. And I think it's really important to understand that risk. And it also goes down to some of the themes about this entire event is about collaboration and interoperability. It's about transparency between not just about the people around us, because it even goes further that the countries are only secure as the countries around us and the countries we do relationships with. Our security goes in a digital realm is beyond borders. And we have to understand that actually in cyberspace, there is no borders. So therefore, we had to make sure that those that we actually do business with and those we actually do trade and do communications, that we have to make sure our security goes beyond our own borders around the world. Ultimately, we'll actually make civilization, society more secure if we start with that element. And we also have to deal with IoT. Not just as the security and social footprint being created for us, but also devices around us are actually recording sensors and activities and cameras recording your picture. As you walk into a shop, there's a camera taking a photograph, which could be streamed on the internet, which could actually be creating a digital footprint of you without your even involvement or interaction with technology, removing the humans completely from it. There's lots of sensors around, lots of things that I've been involved into. I worked on, for example, one of the largest, it was interesting, it was called Big Brother back in 2006, but now they call it Smart City. Nice marketing and branding terms to change it. But it was actually putting CCTVs in the city that was be able to record traffic accidents and criminal activities. And of course, back then it was Big Brother because it was looking at people, but then that data actually became more intelligent and more valuable that they actually were able to turn it into more smart. They were able to then control traffic flow from that data versus just traffic violations. So they advanced it more. But we have to understand, yes, that we're no longer dependent on, we're not directly involved all the time. And technology, like health sensors communicating to the phone, that's then communicating to the cloud, that's then sharing it across multiple countries and other services, I myself, I'm not directly involved in that. And data is being created, for me without my direct involvement. And that's something we have to be very aware of. And it's something that I leverage quite often when I'm in doing hacking and penetration testing. And also earlier this year, it was quite significant that at the World Economic Forum in Davos, they actually increased, cyber attacks used to be in the top 10, but it's now been increased to being the top 3. It's now the third biggest threat to the global economies, just behind climate change and also extreme weather events. Cyber attacks is now bigger than immigration, bigger than war, and violence. Cyber attacks is one of the top 3 greatest impacts to our future. And this is what this indication, and this means that we can no longer stand back and let it kind of happen. We have to take responsibility, and we have to take accountability, and we have to act to make sure that we're actually able to use cyber capabilities and innovations in a much more responsible way. And this is what we need to be able to do. So this is an indicator that it's become a major importance and a major responsibility, and governments are taking acknowledgement of that, and they're reprioritizing their own programs to make sure that we have the right actually strategies and right plans to actually, one is respond to attacks against countries, but also do offensive capabilities against those to prevent them from attacking as well. The other thing as well that's important is that security, as I mentioned, going back to when I started, security was a key to the door. And even in the last 10 years, our defenses have changed significantly. And every year I get to actually do research with my peers in industry. And both those who are actually good ethical hackers, which most people out there who are ethical hackers or hackers, are actually doing good. There is only a few that are actually those that are referred to as cybercriminals, that are doing black hats, or doing personal gain, or doing disruptive usage. But their feedback and response is that if you're still doing traditional security that I was doing 10 years ago or even 15 years ago, if you're relying on actually endpoint protection, if you're relying on monitoring and managing your perimeter through a firewall, if you're relying on antivirus, then your defenses are not enough to protect your organizations. And the problem with this is things like mobile, BYOD, connectivity. Everyone who's walking with a mobile phone in their pocket is an internet connection. So therefore, we have to understand that, yes, our data 10 years ago used to flow out in and out that one ISP connection, a 5 meg pipe that used to have, is now, that 200 meg or 1 gig pipes are now flowing out through mobile phones, through every person that's in the actual organization or in the perimeter. So we have to understand that the perimeter itself has moved. and we can no longer rely on the defenses of the past to actually keep us secure in the future. It's not to say they're obsolete. They still have their uses. You still have to put a lock on your door. You still have to put a lock in your car. You still have to close your door and your windows. You still have to do those things. But by themselves, they're no longer effective at keeping criminals out. And I'll show you shortly, actually, some of those ways to easily bypass those. And we also have humans. Where we have involved humans, we have basically configuration errors. We have human errors. I think it's important to realize that, yes, but the message here is that while humans introduce a risk, it's important that we actually understand of how can we empower them. And we've actually created this problem because we've actually created security solutions and technologies became too complex. It's become way overly complex. Over the years, if you think about it, remember, I don't know who was doing IT back in the 90s, and you had end users calling you, and you didn't want to talk to them. My best friend's my computer. I don't want to talk to end users. So what did we create? The help desk industry. So the help desk industry was created to interface between humans and those technologists. Now, fast forward to today, the security don't want to talk to those engineers as well, those people. And we're now creating psychologists, and we're bringing social into things so that therefore we can communicate cyber hygiene and cyber awareness to end users more effectively. So we need to find ways to simplify security and also to make it much more human-friendly and much more easier to use. And we actually had to turn it so that we empower users. Because one of the results is 80% of hackers actually say humans are the most responsible, accountable for the attacks. It's not to say that they were performing it. Most human involvement is actually unknowingly. They don't know that they're victims. I've actually worked in cases where it actually started at a 6-year-old kid. The 6-year-old kid at home had been the first target, a secondary victim, but the first target in order to gain access to their parents' devices. For that parent to then go into their employment and carry the malicious malware across. But the first person to be targeted was the children. That child was not participating, didn't know what they were doing, but they were a secondary victim. They became a carrier. They became a human accountability, a human element of that attack. So we need to find ways to make sure that we're able to, beyond that perimeter, to make sure that we empower people to respond. Because one of the things is by victimizing humans means that they're not going to report incidents to you. And we want to make sure that people are not afraid to report incidents. They have to be empowered. You have to get people that's not afraid to go to you, I've done something and I'm not sure about whether it was the right thing, therefore we need to respond to that incident. You want people in your organization who's not afraid to speak out. You want to make sure that people are not afraid to actually report incidents. And this is crucial in the future. Another thing is that in one of the areas when I'm doing penetration testing and a lot of ethical hackers and cyber criminals, we target privileged accounts. And one of the reasons why we target privileged accounts is that I can't get away with the crime or I can't get away with the activity until I can make sure I can delete my logs or delete the footprint that I created. You can't actually, you want to be able to hide your tracks. Most cyber criminals don't want to be caught. They don't want to be detected. Most nation-state actors don't want to be detected. They don't want to be found. So one of the important things is that we can't do that until we have the right privileges and rights and permissions to delete your path, or else to leave other breadcrumbs or other distractions that point you in the wrong direction. So privileged accounts are one of the main targets, and I'm going to go through some of the experiences that I've had of trying to get access to privileged accounts. Second to privileged accounts is email access. Email access is now pretty much your digital footprint that you have. If you think about back in the 90s, then email used to be a simple message to a colleague or peer. Fast forward to today, your email is your digital identity. It's where you've been, it's where you're going to, it's who your friends are, it's your documents, it's your location information, it's your Google searches, it's your advertising preferences, which I love to use as one of my techniques, is actually manipulating advertisements that you see in their pages. It's everything about you. It's how you get to work. It's when you log into. Email, if you get access to email, you can get to really intricately know that person very, very well, to getting to the point where we can use email to start predicting that person's behavior. You can get to the point where you know how they're going to go to work. You know even who they're going to meet for lunch and potentially what they're going to have for their lunch days before they even go there. Because you can look at their calendar, you can look at their history, and they actually gather that footprint and put it together. So why is it security no longer working in the way that basically the traditional sense? We used to have a traditional perimeter that we kept our sensitive information, our databases, our servers, all of the files and applications were maintained within that. And it meant that we had to rely 100% on the perimeter itself to be defensive, to keep the bad things out and only allow authenticated, approved users in. But what happened was security wasn't working. So what was the answer? And even myself, I was one of those that was coming to you and saying, we need to do defense in depth. We need layers and segmentation. We need to have basically more layers of security, and we need to have more layers of security and segmentation around roles and responsibilities, applications, and different networks. And we went and we installed things like data vaults. We did firewalls, more networks. We did IDSs, IPSs, SIEMs. And what happened? Cyber attacks continued to increase. Because we were actually not focusing in the right area. Most cyber attacks that I've worked in, the attacker steals a trusted insider's credentials and identity. And when they steal the identity, they simply can bypass all the security controls that's put in place because they're able to impersonate that person. And that's what we're dealing with today, is that no matter what defenses you put in your network, you have to make sure you're able to validate every person's identity, whether it's system, whether it's application, whether it's a service that comes into your networks or organizations or infrastructure. You have the ability to identify those. So, giving a bit of preparation context, kind of some of the challenges and risks, I'm now going to actually share with you the hacker techniques. I'm going to go some of the real world use cases and scenarios that I've worked in. And this particular first one is, so to give you a bit of background, I'm an advisor for critical infrastructure, which also includes maritime. So I've also worked on things like maritime and shipping 2030 innovations. So I was one of the members that was actually looking at the future shipping back as it goes into 2030. And actually some of my ideas have been patented by some of the world's largest maritime companies. And I've also worked on autonomous shipping projects. So I've worked on those for a number of years. And part of that has got me deeply involved now. I'm not a military person. I'm not a Navy person. I have no government background from my employment. And actually, I get really bad seasickness. So for a person that's now, deeply involved in maritime and protecting it, this particular one is quite interesting because what I'm going to explain to you is how a light bulb almost stopped Christmas. So this is a particular ethical hack that I was involved into. It goes over a number of years. And I'll go through this from start to finish to explain some of the techniques that I used and some of the surprises that we faced. Because as you do these repetitive over and over again, sometimes you get quite surprised yourself at some of the methods you actually end up using to gain access. Now, some might tell me that I was once the savior of Christmas, which I probably agree with. I did save Christmas one year. And you're probably thinking about how the hell does a light bulb have to do with Christmas? So let me take you on that journey, okay? So everyone awake? Everyone paying attention? Okay, let's go through. So this is the first one of two use cases. So it starts with pirates. I'm sorry for those in the Navy that might be in the room. I know this is probably a really bad thing to show. However, this actually starts with pirates. It goes back to my involvement with pirates. Not this pirate. So you might be, first of all, you're thinking about pirates, you're already thinking of Johnny Depp. Ladies in the room are probably getting a little excited. It doesn't involve Johnny Depp, and it doesn't involve this type of pirate. The case that I worked on was involving these types of pirates. So as my time advising, some of the companies I worked with in the past, they do maritime physical security. So we do things like providing armed guards for ports. We do armed guards on vessels as they're going through their voyages. And part of my area was to make sure that the infrastructure, the logistics, the data, the insurance, and everything that was logistically planned for those was being protected and secured. Now, going back into between 2005 and 2010, there was a major increase in piracy in the Gulf of Aden. You probably saw Captain Phillips. You probably saw a lot of, maybe some of you had been involved in some of the protection of those waters. But there was a major increase in piracy that was actually quite severe, that there was a lot of ships being held at ransom. There was some fatalities and some major issues that caused a lot of delays, a lot of shipment issues. And what we ended up doing was, between that time, we worked on what was a project that was called Looking Glass. And Looking Glass was a project that was to share intelligence So it was actually any vessel that saw a pirate or a potential danger, they would report it back into Looking Glass, and then Looking Glass shared that with all the other vessels in the area. So it meant that you got early warnings and early notifications in order to either avoid or change your path, or maybe to lock up the vessel, secure it more, prepare defenses for those vessels as well, to be able to fend off potential attacks. So this Looking Glass project was put in place, and it took some time and was being very successful. And my involvement was mainly just the logistics and the technical side of it. I did a lot of advisory, and then once it was successful, then I moved on to other things. I was doing blockchain, doing government advising, and other things, and Looking Glass was working really well. And it wasn't until about 2014 when a lot of these vessels were now planning to bring your Christmas presents from Asia through the Gulf of Aden into the Mediterranean to then put it to the rest of Europe and other places. So a lot of these vessels coming in. It was around September timeframe, and what happened was there was a major increase in successful piracy attacks. And there's a big concern that either Looking Glass was failing. We were worried that it was actually hacked and compromised, that the data was being corrupted. But after further analysis, what we were able to find was that the vessels that had been successfully attacked actually all isolated back to a single ship management company. So we found that the vessels that had been successfully attacked was from this single ship management company. So I was brought back in because of my specialty and knowledge and understanding about the maritime security itself. I was brought back in to actually do a penetration test on the ship management company to identify where possible hackers or cybercriminals had gained access and potentially what data they had access to. They knew they had access to certain information. They realized that it was the manifests of the vessels, the insurance premiums. They knew what it was carrying. They knew whether the vessels had armed guards or defenses on board. They knew the crew members. So they had a lot of information they were gathering that allowed them to know which ships to target to be higher successful. So we're using intelligence, and Somalia itself was not a very high-tech country. They were paying other nations and cyber mercenaries to gather the data for them. So they knew preparation which ships to target. So we were brought in, and we wanted to understand about how to target this particular ship management company and how to gain access to it. So I was given full realm ability to make sure that Christmas was not going to make a lot of unhappy kids in the future. So I'm going to take you into my mind, my preparation that I did for this, and the steps that we took, and the results that we found. So the first thing is that my job, my specialty, is doing reconnaissance. And if you're actually doing any ethical hacking or penetration testing, 90% of the time is actually spent doing reconning. It's actually studying the victim, studying the target, studying the person you're trying to get access to, 90% of the time. So if you think about that, 9 out of 10 days is actually spent doing research, not even touching the target, not even going to any of their systems or even alarming them. 90% of the time is actually doing reconning, looking at basically employee records, looking at the Wayback Machine to look at all their history, their websites, being able to go and look at their social profiles. My job doing reconnaissance is to build the entire digital footprint of that employee of the organizations, to their family, to the kids, to their hobbies, to what sports and teams they like, to their telephone numbers, to their mistresses, to their actual activities that they get up to, is to create that entire blueprint. And then what I do is, once I know, to the point with what vehicles they drive, to how they get to work, to what they eat for lunch, to what cafes they eat in, my job is to pull as much data as possible, correlate it together, and then my job is to create an attack path. I share with a team that goes on site with the planned attack path. So we have multiple attack paths that we look for, and we look for employees that have relationships with other employees in order to know that if I target this person, it only takes me 5 hops to get to the target. Because you don't want to go right after the CFO. You want to keep a low profile. You want to go around the kind of lower sensitive areas to gain access to the main goal. So it's really important to make sure that you do that planning, that well preparation. And 90% of the time, you wouldn't believe the data that we gather at this point in time to how much predictable we can get to the point we absolutely do know where people go and what they have for their lunch. So it's important to know, and this is one thing that people don't do well enough in defensive, You need to do this. I always say that it's really important that if you're doing security and you're standing inside and you're looking at the door like traditional security guards do, and you're not out there looking down the street, then you're going to basically be very reactive to every attack that happens. You need to be looking out your window. You need to be looking down the street to see where attacks are coming from. And this is why events like this, about cooperation and actually transparency, and about knowing when an attack is happening in another country before it hits you, this is how crucial it is those early warnings. So you need to be proactive, and this is one of the things that techniques is used, is that reconnaissance is one of the things that you can use to your advantage so you can actually see where attacks are potentially coming from. So typically in stage 2, what we've done traditionally is after we've done this attack path and we've done all the reconning and passive assessment, we've gathered the data, and we do the understanding of where the weaknesses and how we can gain access to the main targets in the organization who have access to the sensitive data, like the financial information, like the manifests of the ships, like the crew data as well. So step 2, typically we've been using phishing campaigns. And phishing campaigns for us, if we have a short time period of an ethical hack, phishing campaigns are great. They're very quick access, very easy to do, and you're guaranteed that somebody's going to click on something. This is actually a real one that was used last year, which was actually targeting Google Gmail, which is actually embedding a hyperlink with an image that people thought it was an attachment. When they clicked on the attachment, it brought them to the login page, and they simply gave their credentials to the attacker. Now, this is some of the phishing campaigns that we typically do, is we look for how to abuse those. Now, I'll actually give you a really interesting one. I was given a particular government came to me and said, we know your skills in phishing campaigns, we know your skills that you have in doing penetration testing, but we want to see how much success you can do. And I was given a particular bet. So they bet me a bottle of whiskey and a bottle of wine that if I was able to do a phishing campaign that was 100% successful, then I would win the whiskey and wine. And I'm a bit of an ego. I know my skills, and I'm like, okay, bring it on. It's like, yes, I'll take that challenge. So we're given a target of 100 people in a particular department in the government, and we were given full realm to do whatever we did to make them click in what we want them to do. And we decided that we had 7 days to do it, so we had 7-day turnaround that we'd be able to then do the preparation, do the planning, execute it, and then report the results. 7 days is not a lot of time to turn around that. So, of course, the first 5 days, we actually spent doing reconning, doing the research, doing the planning again. So spending a lot of that time preparation. And what we ended up doing was, on a Friday afternoon at 5:30 p.m., guess what we did? Does anyone have a guess? No. No. We give them speeding tickets. They got speeding tickets at 5:30 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. And the reason why we choose speeding tickets, there's a reason behind it. There's a reason behind choosing these types of activities. People don't want to break the law. They don't want to be criminals. It's time-based. You have a crucial element of time. We had a limited time to get them to click on something. So in the speeding ticket, everything was authentic. We were able to pull the default template off the internet. We were able to doctor it to turn it into what we wanted it to be. Every link and telephone number in that email was correct. Everything. If they called the telephone number at 5:30 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, our office hours are Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. Please call back on Monday. They have no way to verify it until Monday. So we knew that we had a window of opportunity from Friday at 5:30 till Monday morning before they can validate the speeding ticket. So in these phishing campaigns, you play with multiple things. You play with time, fear, and impact. Time is an urgency. People have to do it immediately. You want to get time sensitivity. This is why phishing campaigns always use that time of the day. Crucial. People's lunch, first thing in the morning to the thing in the afternoons when they're leaving work trying to get home. Those are the time-sensitive things where basically people are more careless and can actually make mistakes. Or you're looking for times where it's high activity, where you know that they're doing things repetitive. So clicking on something 100 times, if I do the next one, I'm just doing my job. I'm doing repetitive. And then, of course, you have to have a money impact. So in the speeding ticket, we had a fine. And if you didn't pay the fine or click on the link and acknowledge it within 24 hours, it doubled. If you didn't do it in 2 hours, it tripled. So if somebody's sitting there now, they don't want to be illegal, they don't want to be a criminal, they want to be good citizen. They're now faced with 24 hours before they find doubles. It's time-based, so there's an urgency, and they can't validate the authenticity of it. Those are the crucial things. Is you enable them to actually unable to verify and authenticate, then they will be careless. So with this, what happened was, Sunday evening, I was looking at the results, and I had 99 out of 100 people. And I was like, we were all high-fiving. We cracked open our own bottle of wine. We thought we were all, great, this is going to be no problem. Monday morning, we'll wake up and we'll go, we did it. Monday morning, I get up, and it was still 99 out of 100. And I was just like, I was angry. You don't want to see me angry. But I was really angry. And I went in, I was up, and I was like, I know the government's going to be going, you didn't do it successfully. But they were quite impressed with their results, to be able to get 99% success of a phishing campaign. You're always going to have success in phishing campaigns. That's the important thing. That's one of the messages, is that phishing campaigns will always be successful. It's the impact that you have of the result that you want to limit, the risk that they have. So when we interviewed, I went in that Monday morning, I said, I don't want to talk to the 99 people, I want to talk to that one person who didn't click on it. I want to know why. So they got the interview, we sat down, I asked the person, so we did everything, we had your car details, we had your address, why didn't you click on the email? Guess what the response was? Well, no, we checked it, we had everything planned, we checked everything was authentic, all the planning, preparation was all done. 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon, they went home, turned off their phone. So the moral of this is sometimes it's good to go home and not work. And this person didn't turn on their phone until Monday morning. And it taught us a lesson. When we heard that, and we were like, that's interesting, because we didn't think of it in that perspective. We were only focused at success, and we knew we could be successful. And when I actually shared this use case, an example that we actually had with other governments, so I got to present at other countries, and they listened to this session. And then in Ireland, one of the government agencies, during the NotPetya attack, they remembered what I told them about that person turning off the phone and not having access to email. So during NotPetya, they disabled access to email for all non-essential personnel. And you know what their impact to NotPetya was? 0. Because they're able to control the method of actually delivery of the payload. And that's what we have to understand, is email today is still that primary payload. It's still the number one method of actually deploying malicious activities and malicious malware, ransomware, and so forth. So it's really important that you have that ability to understand that mechanism. Is a question?
Yeah, sorry, it's just out of curiosity from like a pen test design for that particular instance. Just curious what your approach to the reconnaissance was. Was it primarily, or was it 100% digital reconnaissance, or was there some physical elements in it?
It was all 100% digital. Yeah, it was online. I created some tools myself. I got a lot of my reconning tools that I use. I got tired of doing it manually, so I created my own tools that helps me do it a lot automated. So we do a lot more correlation of it. So, but it's a good question. Yes, that was a digital recon. So question.
To get the from address for the tickets that you were mailing, how did you get the from address to be valid?
That was easy. It was basically able to spoof it. The only thing they would have been able to do is if they looked at the email source, then they'd be able to see that it wasn't coming from the authentic, but we spoofed the email address. If they replied, then that would have been an issue. If they replied to the email, they may have got suspicious. So, but we did spoof everything. So to the authenticity and to even the URL itself that they were going to was basically a simple domain character off the original one. And they didn't have a valid certificate for the site either. So it's important to understand. So we were, going back to, segue back into the Christmas tree and Christmas and light bulbs. We were preparing, not this exact one, but we were already planning our phishing campaign against the ship management company. And what was interesting was that, so I planned and did everything from Estonia, give it to the team. They went on site to a country which I can't name, to perform this on-site attack. And one of the team members decided that he was going, wait, I want to try something. He was getting very much into, when we got involved in the maritime, we were doing a lot with radio signals. So we were thinking that he was playing around. He had done a lot with drones and AIS devices and GPS, and he thought, he has this new device he would put together and says, can I use this before we start the phishing campaign? And we were like, sure, we've got a couple of hours before we're actually going to engage this, so go ahead. So he went with his backpack, basically with a massive radio sucker. So radio signal sucker. It was basically an SDR with multiple antennas that was basically sucking all radio signals. So he walked around the office building of the target, off the ship management company. And what we were able to do with that was it pulled back every Bluetooth, radio signal, Wi-Fi, hidden Wi-Fi, was all sucked back in. We were able to the point where we could create a heat matrix we knew where people were sitting in the office in the building by just walking around and sucking up all the frequencies and everything that we possibly could. And when we brought it back and we started analyzing the data we had an apartment that we had rented and we had a whole lab set up in the city. And as we basically were analyzing the data, we started seeing something unusual. We saw the regular things, people's Bluetooth, their hotspots, their Wi-Fi. You saw printers and other things. And then there's one MAC address that kept repeating, and we're going, this is unusual. We'd never seen it before. So we decided to stop the phishing campaign. We decided to move to looking at this new area that we're finding. And when we end up doing basically a reverse lookup of the MAC address, it turned out to be a light bulb. So we were very curious about, this is the first time we came across an IoT device that was a Wi-Fi connected light bulb that was actually in a company. We came across other things that was used in SCADA controls and in other areas, but it's the first time we've seen a light bulb. And we decided that we're going to look further into this. So we actually went and we bought the light bulbs. We looked for vulnerabilities. We set them up in our lab, and we actually looked for ways to gain access. And one thing we found that there was lots of vulnerabilities, lots of known vulnerabilities for these devices. And these were some of the earlier devices as well that were being used, some of the first versions, the A versions, A1s, H1s that were out there that were available. And what we ended up finding was that they had configured it with web Wi-Fi because it wasn't compatible with the actual the router that they were using. So they actually had to do backwards compatibility. So what did we do? After finding all of that, we went basically back, and we basically analyzed the initialization factors and sequences, and we were able to guess the web password in 30 minutes. Then we joined the network as a light bulb. So we pretended we were just one extra light bulb in the network. And this is what's really important, is that when you're now looking to explore the network under a legal user or service or application or device, how many of you are looking for an extra light bulb in your network? Let's just say they weren't. They weren't looking for more light. Some people are scanning for devices, doing discovery of hardware, virtual machines, applications. They were not looking for a light bulb. We knew that it was an easy way to gain access. So we actually pretended to be a light bulb, and what that allows you to do is now you're connected to the network. It doesn't give you any ability to do malicious activity or do further lateral moves. It just gives me one foot in the door. And then what happens is, during you've got one foot in the door, it allows you to start. It's like being in a hotel and looking at the hotel room and just watching who in the corridors moving where and what rooms they're accessing, what protocols they're using. Now, it's really interesting. One of the areas is that I spend a lot of time monitoring and observing the traffic. What's really important at that point in time is you have one foot in the door, is you don't want to create alarms. You don't want to create triggers that actually notify that you're there. You spend most of your time observing, because one of the things you want to be able to do is actually understand when you're doing things like patch deployments, when you're doing scans in the network. You want to understand what technologies and what services they're using to manage the network, what software delivery mechanisms they're using, how they're patching systems. You want to understand about who's logging into what. Sometimes one of the steps here, which is usually one of the areas that we do, is we try to create a problem on the system we're on to get a help desk worker to log into that system. So we create problems to actually get somebody who has privileged credentials to log into the system we have. That's one of the common techniques, is to create a problem and to lure someone who has those keys to give access to you. But as we were under this light bulb, when we were actually doing and looking around the network, we realized that we actually were not on the corporate network. We were on a guest network. and we only had access to conferencing rooms and shared areas. There was some printers, there was a conferencing room, a TV, and we only had access to those. Now, one of the misconceptions that many people have is that people assume that hackers and cybercriminals use things like open source tools and Kali, and you probably heard about it at lots of conferences, and these are toys. Very rarely do we use them in the real world. Because when I use these in the real world, people are looking for them. I prefer not to be detected. I prefer to be able to stay under the radar. And one of the things is the best hackers out there, they live off the land. They live off the existing tools that's already deployed in the networks. So if you're using System Center, I'll join in and take part of System Center. If you're using Active Directory, if you're using some software management solution, I will look. If you're using vulnerability assessments, it's better for me to go to the vulnerability scanner that you're using and look at your vulnerability results rather than it is for me to scan it myself. It's better for me to access your SIEM and look at your logs that you're gathering than it is for me to go and do it myself. So there's a misconception out there that a lot of people think that these are good for learning the techniques, but when you're in the real world, very rarely you get to use those. The only time I've ever actually used the likes of Kali is when you get into a company who is not managing their network themselves, so you have to have something. So you'll introduce your own management tools. Actually doing the work for them in many cases, doing inventory, vulnerability scanning. You can simply give them a report and say, you need to do these things. But very rarely these are used in the real world. So it's really important for you to understand they will use your own tools against you. Even your own security solutions. One of the biggest hacks that never happened, and this is one of the things that sometimes you never hear about the successes, you only hear about the problems and the challenges. I was actually worked on one of the biggest hacks that never happened. And the reason why was that we were actually about to deploy one of the largest financial organizations in the world. We were about to deploy a software update to over 300,000 systems. I still can't name the organization, but that kind of limits you to a few. However, so we're about to do a software update, both patching, new versions of the software being rolled out to over 300,000 systems. And we went through all of our integrity, all our UAT, all our acceptance testing. Everything was done. And you know what was really weird at the end when we actually went through all of our testing? It worked. We were surprised that we didn't come up against any blocking issues. We were surprised. We're like, oh, this is unusually successful. And one of the things we found was that at the end, when we sat down and we were thinking about it, it was like 11th hour before we were actually about to hit the button to deploy it. And we're sitting thinking, something's not right here. This is too good to be true. We had a gut feeling that something's just not right. So one of the things we ended up going back and we decided to do was a basically just unplanned, unscheduled vulnerability integrity check of the software catalog. We hadn't planned it. It wasn't in our calendar. We just decided to do this randomly. And then what did we find? One of the pieces of the software catalog, one of the file hashes, didn't match the previous one. The cybercriminals knew our plan. They knew when we were doing things. They knew when we were about to deploy software. They knew when we had done our work. And they had stayed hidden, waiting for that time that we had finished. Between that time and the time we were going to hit the go button, they'd switched the software, and we were going to deploy their malware using our solutions and our techniques. We were doing it for them. And it was that one random thing, one unpredictable schedule. And this is one thing you have to get into the habit. And I know this is sometimes hard to do, is actually to be unpredictable. Unpredictable is your friend in actually cybersecurity. If you do things ad hoc, out of calendar, out of schedule, you will better finding the criminals or the actors on your networks when they realize that you've got that time when they think you're not looking for them. Therefore, you're going to detect them more likely. So these are the important things that you have to understand about when you're doing network scanning and you're betting yourself. So one of the things then, once I've understand the network and I've actually looked around and see what devices, and I see I'm on the guest network and there's a TV and there's a desktop computer, and we end up getting access to that desktop computer very easily. We end up having some exploits and some vulnerabilities that hadn't been patched. It was a conferencing room PC that had things like vendor presentations, spreadsheets that had been done for like over 4 years. Everyone who had been in that meeting room that had plugged a USB stick into that machine and presented it on the TV, it was all sitting on that desktop. All sitting there for us to access. Years of data that had never been cleaned up and never been patched because it wasn't classified as a high-risk device, as something of important. It's a shared device that is there to serve its means of displaying on a TV. But we were able, because it was connected to the TV, we were able to then get the microphone and the camera to work. We extracted all of the hashes from that system off-site. We cracked them because they were using weak passwords. It only took us about 25 minutes to crack a password. Came back in, and we elevated it to actually local administrator rights. We also found service configuration problems, so they actually incorrectly configured services that we were able to break permissions as well from a hierarchy level. So there's many things that we could have done to elevate the rights. There's also zero-day vulnerabilities as well from Task Scheduler. We're able to elevate using Task Scheduler as well very easily. So there's multiple ways that we can elevate the privileges. But the crucial thing was, what happens in meeting rooms? Meetings. And what happens when you're on that same meeting room and you've got access to the camera and the microphone, and executives come in, are the most common people that use meeting rooms? We had the executive team during that same day come into the meeting room, sitting around, we could hear and see everything they were doing, to the point where they're typing in their keyboards, the conversations they were having. Problem was that it was a different language to me, so I had to get a translator. But I can't reveal the language. So with this particular, we were able to see, but the local administrator that we were able to crack on that desktop PC was exactly the same that was on their devices that they connected to. And what's the problem is that when people go to meeting rooms, they tend to use the Wi-Fi connection that gives them less challenges and less restrictions, less problems, and they will choose that. They sometimes use their mobile phones, but in this case, they use the guest Wi-Fi because they were able to then surf pages that they would have not been able to do in the corporate network. And once they connected, it literally was minutes, it was seconds before we were able to install a RAT, a remote access tool, on their device. What did they do when they finished the meeting? You simply carry it, walk past into their desk, plug it into the corporate network, and it was game over. We had full access to the CFO's machines, to the CEO's machines, to the manifests. What we ended up finding, though, is that while we find a unique way into that organization through the light bulb, of course, that we end up finding that that's one of many. When the finding was that the actual, of course, it went through a traditional method of email and get access to a person's system that had remote access and was sending it out to command and control, that was extracting things like the manifest, insurance, the career information and so forth that we're using in order to know what ships to target. But it's important to know that eventually the method that we get in, we end up getting to the same problem that the actual other criminals that have been using. And simply from maintaining access, the next thing is conducting malicious activity. That's where my job stops. That's where I'm not allowed to go any further at malicious activity. But you get to see where people can abuse it and gain access, and we have human error, we have mistakes that's been made. And the interesting thing is that as we go through, one of the areas, of course, is to remain undetected and cover your tracks. One of the interesting things was when we actually presented back and we got the results, it's all about reducing risk. When we report back to the executives of the organization, in this case, it was one of the transportation ministries for the country, that when we present back the results and we went through the whole process, that, do you know what we ended up finding? We wanted to know why the light bulbs were installed, why they would go through a scenario. And this, of course, ship management company is not so energy efficient and green. So what they ended up doing was they wanted to meet certain emissions and green-friendly regulations. So they forced the leasing company who actually owned the building they were renting to actually reduce their emissions and reduce their energy footprint. So the leasing company decided that how are we going to do that? We're going to install smart LEDs. Then they control the luminance, the energy consumption, turn them off when they're not being used in order to meet the needs of their tenant so they can actually show that they're energy efficient. And what the finding was that all of a sudden just an energy efficient project resulted in a major vulnerability. When we went to the vendor who provided the light bulb, what was really interesting was that when we went to the vendor with that light bulb and we asked about how do we patch these light bulbs, we had to unscrew them, plug them into to a laptop and flush the firmware. And we had 1,000 light bulbs. So they decided that it was actually better to go back to non-smart light bulbs because the energy efficiency that we were gaining, but the risk that was exposed was significant. So some of the lessons you learn is that some of the projects, it needs to mean that you had to have coordination, you had to have communication about who's actually installing technology, and whether it being a fridge or even a vacuum cleaner in the office that's actually going and wiping the floor while the staff are not there. We try to automate and make our lives much easier, and some of those initiatives are not done from basically a risk-based approach. Every time you install any type of technology, whether it being a computer or a light bulb, you need to take a risk-based assessment on it. We're no longer, one of the things we have to get out of the mindset is that we're no longer cybersecurity professionals. We're risk professionals that have cybersecurity expertise. We all had to get out of the mindset that we're actually here to do security and cybersecurity. We're here to evaluate risk and to determine how to reduce that risk, and using our knowledge and experience of cybersecurity to do that. That's what we have to get into the mindset. We're here to help the businesses, help reduce the risk, help actually make sure that we're actually spending the money in the right areas. And if we're doing security for the sake of security, we're not going to be successful. But if we're doing it for the sake of actually benefits, value, improvements, then we'll actually focus on the right area. So we all need to become risk-based people and doing a risk-based approach to this. So I'm going to move into my next. Any questions on this before I move into the second hack? Okay, so we'll move along and we'll leave the questions a little bit later. So the next hack that I got involved into shortly after this. So this was around September 2014, and around 2015, I got a call saying, you've done some things around engines and hacks in IoT and SCADA controls and stuff. And I was asked would I do a penetration test on a power station. They had this newly built power station, hundreds of millions was spent on it, fully automated, latest technology, latest cybersecurity. And they said, okay, we'd like you to put a team together and go and do a penetration test on a power station. So I thought, I like a challenge. And I worked on the Ukrainian energy sector incident, so I was an incident responder to that, and helped do some of the actually remediation effects and also some of the resiliency that was put in later. So I thought I'll kind of go, and I've done all the penetration tests in other energy companies as well. So this particular one was of interest, so I thought since it had the latest technology, I wanted to see what I can do. And of course, we know the critical part of power stations. We've had the U.S. Department of Energy releasing 159 successful attacks over a 4-year period. And of course, we had the Ukraine energy sector. And this particular one, of course, that 86,000 homes, one of the things that they used, the technique that I mentioned earlier, about being able to get, if I cause a problem with the hard disk in a system, who's that person going to call? The help desk. They log in, and they basically, they elevate the credentials that way. And that was actually one of the things that happened in the Ukrainian energy sector, was actually causing poison pill, causing hard disk problems that allowed basically the ability to elevate those privileges from a help desk worker logging in. So it's really important to understand the possibilities in the areas of power stations. And of course, we have the risk of insiders as well. This is a assistant minister of a paper factory that actually caused over $1 million in damages because they became unhappy with the employer. So we want to make sure that we understand the risks that insiders pose, and also the potential risks that having a power station going offline could potentially have to a country, or multiple countries depending on the location. So again, last year we had the state hospitals declaring state of emergency as well through major attacks. So we can actually get into the point. I used to work in the ambulance service, and one of the things that I got involved into when I worked in hospitals and worked in critical infrastructure was that I realized that my job was so critical. I had an SLA. If I didn't keep my systems up for 21 minutes, people died. And that was how I measured the success of my systems, was how many people did not die that year. And that's what you have to realize, is that these systems provide a critical role to our environments, whether it being healthcare, whether it being energy, power. That power is keeping somebody's defibrillator on, keeping somebody life-saving. That's the crucial to the environment and society we live in. So these are the ways I get involved in a lot of these critical areas to make sure that we find ways to make sure that I don't get in that situation where 21 minutes is getting closer, that we keep it away from that time frame. So that's my nightmare, is that one, life is at threat when we end up having systems down. So again, I'm going to go through the techniques that I used for this particular one, which was very different. I can't believe how different it was that you have to adopt your techniques. And this is one that's crucial, is that you have to be able to understand how you can be dynamic and how you can look at something and change your traditional methods you would typically do in order to get to an ultimate goal of showing the risks that was there. So I'm going to go through these techniques that was used. So this is my use case penetration test called the power hack. And again, inside my mind of this hack. So the target was a power station. Now, it's very different from a ship. Because I thought it's simply just a floating one of these. My mind was just like, I was thinking, it's just a big engine. This time it's not floating, it's in a static location. Should be much easier. It's on land. I have, easier access to get to. I don't have to go through kind of weird realms to get access to it. So my mind was thinking that I just was doing another one of these, and I would go through the same techniques that I would use to hack a ship. However, I was so not right. Because when you get to power stations, the physical security is a lot different from a ship. A lot different from a ship. They basically had armed guards around the power station. They had on-call helicopters. They basically had multiple fences, high-level fences, sensor detection that if you went up near the fence, that would actually set off triggers. So the challenge I had was I wasn't going to get the same guy with the backpack walking around outside the power station picking up Wi-Fi signals. That wasn't going to happen here. So I was thinking about, well, how can I change my methods and techniques to gain access to the power station? So let's go into my mind, and when I started thinking about how do I achieve this, what was the outcome? So I spent a lot of time, again, doing reconnaissance. So I started looking at, well, what SCADA controls, what PLCs are power stations using, what ICSs had they been deployed. So I had this information about this particular power station. I was able to find the blueprints of the construction, who constructed it, what vendors supplied the information. I was able to get all of that online. So I was able to know exactly what types of hardware. I was able to go through photographs of the power station at its launch and try to determine basically the security that they had deployed. So I was looking through basically pictures, videos, online information, supply chain information to try and get a complete picture of this. And I ran into a bit of challenges because one of the things I realized from doing the reconnaissance, which actually alarmed me a bit, was actually that I wasn't going to be able to do step 2. Step 2 was not going to be possible because of the actually phishing campaigns would not. I realized during the recon that phishing campaigns was not going to work. So I had to come up with an alternative plan. And this alternative plan was genius. I hope you agree with me. My role was a photographer. I found out during the reconning that they were planning to do a TV commercial at the power station. And I'm pretty handy with a camera. So I got a job with a TV commercial crew as a cameraman. And was able to do step 2. That got me into the environment of the power station physically. Not as a user, but as a guest. Physically in the power station. That was the most difficult thing for me to get into. And I had to come up with a plan. I searched, and I basically, to get that job as a camera person, there's some people I had to pay off. It cost me money. But I was able to get access to go in to do this commercial, to be a photographer. And going in, the actual security, the IDs, no one knew any better. I was there as a photographer, part of the crew that was going to do a commercial. Now, the security was quite impressive because when I got there, we had to register the car. They gave us a 5-minute window. So we had 5 minutes to drive that car up to the gate. If we arrived 1 minute before, armed guards were taken away, double-checked. 1 minute after, helicopters, armed guards. We had a 5-minute window, pre-registered, everyone in the car, colored the car, vehicle, when we were going to arrive at that time. We had to do that every single day that we were coming to the station. Physical security was impressive. I was gobsmacked. I couldn't fault it. I went in as the guest. So then, of course, my problem was that I don't have anything. I had actually Quite a few, USB sticks in my pockets. I had things that was plugged in. I was looking for ways to maybe leave a back door or find ways to plug devices in. So my network scanning wasn't the traditional sense of network scanning. My network scanning was walking around looking for actually USB ports. That was my network scanning at that point in time. And of course, I'm going in, I'm taking pictures around, I'm looking at the actual valves. I got to play with the valves of the engines. And I was actually at the same time recording all the risks that I identified. Of course, the engines, there was 2 engine rooms, 40 engines. They were dual engines. They were LNG, gas, and also diesel. And they also had basically failovers. And each engine had its own valve control, sensor, pressure, water, and so forth that I could access. But I labeled that as a very low security risk because, again, you had to get through the security to access the front panel, which was not secured. And I can only damage or change the pressure or valves of one engine at a time. And both rooms were separated as well. So I was going through and looking for network scanning, and I'm looking for ports, I'm looking for computers. Everything was locked, secured, panels, pipes. There was no way for me to go in actually to connect to any cables, to plug in USB devices. And I was kind of going, how am I going to do this? So I kind of continued through. And of course, later we got into the command and control, where of course the PLCs came into, and then of course you had SCADA controls, which was managing those sensors and valves. And they had 2 command and control centers that were side by side, each one managing each engine area. And again, I came up with this. Everything was locked behind closed, not like here where they have the keys in the doors. There was no keys in the doors that I had. Everything was locked, so I couldn't access the back of the computers. I couldn't try to plug in USB sticks. Even though I had physical access, I was able to go around and start looking at what vendors, what versions they were using, what operating systems. I was able to collect all of that information in order to potentially, maybe I had to do something later. So I had the physical access to command and control. They're running this commercial. They're doing pictures. And I'm literally just there with the camera going, click, click, zoom in on the desktop, click, seeing what desktop icons I could see, what's running. So trying to get an interpretation of what was in the environment. And again, I ran into problems. I couldn't fault it. And at this point in time, I was thinking that this is a pretty impressive security. Everything physical-wise, being escorted around, that the valves to the doors to everything was sealed off and not visible from my hands. So I'm in my mind thinking, is there a way for me to gain access to any type of privileges in this environment? They were using the latest SCADA controls. These things cost $1.5 million. Latest advanced threat protection. Firewalls, security off the roof. They spent millions. This thing cost close to $1 billion. Latest technology. And then it happened. Sitting on the table, exactly identical to this piece of paper that I took a photograph of. Because I had a camera. I was meant to be taking pictures. Just didn't see what I was taking pictures of. URL, IP address, username, password, and system owner. Of all systems in the environment, printed on a piece of paper, sitting on the table. Default vendor credentials. 4 years old from actually construction of the plant. Clear text URLs, they weren't encrypted because they assumed that it was a closed network. And horrible passwords. Horrible. If you're in password management, it was horrible. I mean, my kid could probably crack it. But this is what I was faced with. Sitting, and my head just started going, this started coming into my head. It's like human error, like what's going on? Default vendor passwords to the security systems that had 1.5 million to protect the systems, and there's the keys to that system sitting in front of me. And alarm bells went off, and I started thinking, cyber fatigue. Is people just so, overwhelmed with cybersecurity and information overload that they just don't bother changing passwords and don't want to remember them? So we go down to that bare minimum, very bad practice of printing on a piece of paper and then sharing them. That meant that everyone who had worked in that power station had knowledge of those passwords, including the vendors who installed it. Even the cleaners and people who were just doing maintenance and third-party contractors who come in that piece of paper is sitting visible for everyone to see. So at that point in time, of course, we know that hackers say that default vendor credentials are the easy way to elevate and gain access to systems. It's common. They know that most cases, that 25% of the time, you're going to be able to elevate. You're going to be able to get access to that. So at this point in time, I actually stopped. If I was to do it again, I wouldn't have stopped. If I was to go back to that actual penetration test, I would have continued. I made the mistake thinking that this was a really bad risk, that this was poor practice, and that I needed to report it immediately. So in my mind, that I already thought that basically, at this point in time, I needed to report it to the board. And I was actually shocked. When I went and reported this to the board, and I showed my findings, and I said, default vendor credentials, everything was in clear text. I could access it from that network right there. I could log into any of those consoles, and I could shut down the power station. I could literally, from that command and control, shut down the power. And you know what the board said to me? It was a low risk. And they said, it's a closed system. It can't be accessed from the outside. You need to have privileges, and you need to have a system on the network that allows to have access to it. So they considered it a low risk, and they decided to do nothing. And I was just, in my mind, I'm going, how do you consider this a low risk? When you involve humans, there's no such thing as an error gap. If you involve light or sound, there's no such thing as an error gap. If I have access to any of those elements, I can bypass the network. And they're still in this mindset that they go back to the power station. Their main focus was perimeter security. Their main focus was those big walls and helicopters and armed guards, was keeping it safe. And that fixation that they had this area protected, that no one could access it. So I said, okay, give me some time and I'll prove you wrong. And the board's going, okay, what, you're going to defeat our armed guard security and gain access and shut down from the system? I said, no. So just give me some time and I'll prove you that this is a major risk. I said, I'll be able to obtain and maintain access to the systems, and if I wish to, I could shut down the power station. And they thought, okay. So they give me full reign again to say, go back. And I had some time frame to go and being able to do this. So I went back to the team, and we looked at our recon again. We looked at the information that we gathered at the beginning, and we went back to the data to try and determine how can we gain access to that network, to the systems that could potentially shut down the power station. So we come up with another genius idea. We called a service fault. So we actually went to a particular area that we knew that had access, that was close proximity to the power station, and we reported a service fault saying the electricity wasn't working. So the power station sends out one of their engineers in a service truck, parks it, and they go up and they start fiddling about with the power and the junction box. We stole their laptop. Actually, we borrowed their laptop because we had to give it back. We stole their laptop. We took it. Sitting in the vehicle, it was logged in. We opened up a VPN connection to the network, and I was sitting with the login page to the SCADA control system. Took the laptop, walked into the board, set it down in front of them. I said, tell me that this is not a risk now. This is the mindset you have to get into. You have to think outside the box. You have to understand about the realms and the things that people will go to in order to basically be successful. And understand that all limitations are off the... when you get into cybercrime, I have limitations of what I can do as long as I can get out of jail free, or I know the laws, I know the regulations that I have to adhere to, because that's my limitations. The two things that's the most difficult thing for me is, one is I've limited with time, I've limited with resources, money, and actually limited with the legal system. I have to abide by the law, unless I'm permitted basically certain extensions of that at certain times. But cybercriminals don't. They don't have to kind of go the same realms that we do. And when you report the risks, you have to actually show them the potential, and we showed them the potential that somebody could access, if they did have the default vendors, that they could shut down the power. They could all of a sudden mean that basically they could have serious energy ramifications. If we did it during Christmas or during a holiday period, that was going to be a disaster. They'd have a blackout. Even though that power station was a backup, it was a auxiliary power station to bring on energy when the main lines needed it, or it was there to sell off to other means or to use it from other energy sources, that still, at crucial times, you could actually cause severe disruption. So they end up accepting it and realizing that they needed to acknowledge and take responsibility. And this is what my point is that we are now in an area of risk-based people. We have to evaluate the risks and show the risks and show the potential impact of those risks. And cybersecurity is a means of reducing the risk. That's what we have to get into communicating. And that's what I've learned over going to boards over time and time again, that I had to show the actually impact of the business and that the investment they make in security will actually help save them money and reduce the risks. And whether that's insurance or whether it's reduction in things like compliance and regulation fines, you have to make the relationship between security, risk, and business. You have to map those together. And if you can't do it, you're not going to get the board to accept what you want them to do. So you have to get into that, and that's some of the things that I've learned from doing these things. So, of course, the next step I could have done is the malicious activity, which is shut down the power station, which could cause them severe damage and loss of millions. Covering the tracks. One of the things you have to learn about covering the tracks, and a lot of times I also get involved in doing digital forensics. And all the time when I'm covering the tracks, I'll talk about a particular case that I worked on many years ago, actually last year. Covering tracks, I always find that when I'm doing these investigations that sometimes the breadcrumbs or the traces that's left behind are distractions, or they're actually misdirections to the real crime. A particular case that I worked on last year was a ransomware case in Ukraine that the government brought in external CERT members to investigate particular cases that they were providing financial support to help organizations who were victims of ransomware recover. And this particular case went in, and we'd worked on many of them, and all of a sudden this one particular case did not go to the event chain or the typical events that we would see in a ransomware case. And it kind of stumbled us, so we ended up deciding to do further investigation, pull more logs files back, do more scraping, and do more evaluation. What we ended up finding was that this particular organization had actually inflicted themselves with ransomware to cover up another crime of financial fraud. So sometimes you have to understand that when we find, and you're looking at tracks, sometimes what you're looking at is not the true motive. When you're doing these types of things of attribution or digital forensics or incident response, you also have to understand the mindset is that follow two main things that I do is money and motive. If you focus on those two things, you're more likely to find the true attribution. Rather than looking at the weapon or the tool that's used, is sometimes a misdirection. And we would actually, in many cases, we would actually leave traces that pointed to another hacker organization to make you think that it's coming from another country or another attribution to make you spend all your time chasing the wrong direction. So some of the lessons I have for you to learn from these things is what's the lessons? It's important that we educate. We need to invest in people equally as we invest in technology. Technology alone is not going to solve all our problems. People alone are not going to solve all the problems. And we need to create a balance between both. And we need to invest equally in people to know how to use the tools, to know how to actually be more aware and more educated and more cautious and more actually sensitive to the things they're handling, to the fundamentals of security. People and technology are the solution for our future cybersecurity problems, and we need to balance that very equally. So taking a people-centric approach, what that means is making security simple. If we make it easier to use, easier to adopt, faster to install, value from day one, rather than value from day 6 months or 2 years. Because the first security solution I was deploying in 2001, it took 2 years to deploy. Today, if it takes 2 years to deploy, the attackers are already moved on from what you're trying to solve. So we need to make it easy to use, easy to deploy, easy to adopt, less complex. Multi-factor authentication for everything. You need to have, multi-factor authentication needs to be an opt-out. It's not an opt-in, it's an opt-out. These are the things, if those organizations that we were actually using, for example, phishing campaigns, We would not have been successful if they're using multi-factor authentication. It would have meant that we would have had another security control to break, which is more difficult and more time-consuming and more costly for us. So for emails and all sensitive privileged accounts, multi-factor authentication is a must. You need to be able to validate trust, to validate identities, to validate systems, to augment and make trust dynamic. And multi-factor or even two-factor authentication for a lower cost is ways to achieve that. It's better than doing nothing. It's better than just a password being the only thing between me and your sensitive systems. Encryption. Encryption should be at data at rest, any sensitive data. What I've done is that I got to the point where I worked on a lot of data loss prevention techniques and classification, and it got very difficult to classify data because it changed all the time. It was growing. It was changing classification on a daily basis and system owner and so forth. What I ended up doing was classifying the applications that has access to sensitive data and then making sure that the application ran in encryption. That's the important thing is if you understand the door or the means of accessing it, then you want to make sure that you encrypt any application that has access to sensitive information versus trying to do it at a data level. Data level is much more complex and much more, let's say, changing all the time. And then automating the management of privilege access and privilege accounts. These things make my job more difficult. If the power station didn't have the piece of paper printed and didn't have the default vendor credentials, then even stealing that laptop would have not been able to do me any benefit. And again, the ship management. If they had actually also used privilege access management, those local accounts would have not been the same password as the account that was on the executive systems. All these things make my job more difficult, and that's what I want to educate you and share with you, is what makes my job more difficult. So ultimately, when we think about it, it all comes down to identities. So some of the ways that actually makes my job challenging is if you're actually going and managing the identity. And that is a person, as a system, an application, a service, a device. It can be anything. But managing it as an identity. And then using multi-factor in order to build what I call as trust, or trust anchor, or trust score. Being able to build trust into, they provide multiple methods of identification, verification, peer reviews. Other devices are where, it's like what we have in society. If you get introduced to somebody else through somebody else you trust, then you have a level of trust of that person as well. So we have to get into doing that in systems and networks as well. Is that, do these systems know of each other? And building a trust mechanism that allows you to create what I refer to as dynamic security. And then separating privilege accounts from those people, our systems. That I was a domain administrator for 100,000 servers back in 2000. And I had one domain administrator account that had access to all those 100,000 systems. One account with me. It meant that I could fix things very quickly. But what I realized was that if I was ever compromised, it was one account for a cybercriminal that could have used to abuse all of those systems. I should never need to know or have a domain administrator account in my hands at any time. It should be on demand when I need to, on request, and I should never know the password. We need to have less domain administrators and a more actually augmentation of privileges. Ultimately, all of those will make it more difficult for the attacker to be able to gain access. And the core fundamentals of the access controls. And if I give you a real-world example, I'm based in Estonia, and many of you maybe know of Estonia as one of the most innovative countries in the world. We invented things like Skype, transfer-wise. So, and this was actually, Estonia's been using blockchain and identity since 2002. Of course, the research came from 1998. And this is an idea. What they've done is, in the top level, is the data repositories. And they've de-risked the data repositories. So data is only written once in each of those repositories. And then the actual data, metadata is flagged as this is where it's located. So if the telco needs to call me or needs to send something in my post, then the telco needs to get my address from the document register or the population register. So they need to make a request into that. And all of those requests back and forward into these repositories goes through the security servers. And those security servers are access logs that are actually then go into a blockchain that gets decentralized, meaning that no one can tamper with the evidence at any point in time later. And then the bottom level here is the access controls. So you come in with different roles, whether you're a public servant, entrepreneur, business owner, citizen. You validate those, and allows you to gain access to the data. And any access to those data is documented, recorded. So I can audit if a public servant accesses my vehicle registration, it's transparent to me. I can see that and have visibility to who has access and who views my data. So if you look at the identities, the access controls, the de-risking of data into separate repositories, and making sure that if even one of those was compromised, that the rest are actually remained integrity. And that's one of the important things of de-risking the data across multiple security and data vaults. And we had to get into this habit of understanding, and this is what Estonia was able to then do and replicate this in their data embassies. That means that Estonia is no longer dependent on its physical land itself. So what are the privileged accounts and how do you manage it? What's the kind of key areas here? Well, it's all about users, computers, applications, and services. And each of those actually combines with some type of privilege. And what we need to be able to do is each of them has privileged users, you've got privileged computers, and privileged applications. I needed to segment and segment each of those in order to be able to make sure that no one person has access at any time. And what they need to do is go through an access control to check them out and use them. And this allows you to do things like, for example, vaulting and encryption, access controls to the accounts, auditing, monitoring, and password management, meaning those passwords get rotated every time I use them on a time-based, every day, every minute. If a human's not using it, you can rotate that as much as you possibly want to. Meaning that no one person in the organization will have unfederated access to all the systems. You reduce insider threats, reduce the vendor default password issues, you make it more difficult for cybercriminals to access your organizations. So if you look at it, what is it like without a privileged access management if you're not putting it in place? Well, most people will go through an Active Directory authentication mechanism. You have internal users, external users, administrators who have access to all systems. Then you've got systems who can access other systems. And so you have this web of mess and access all over the place. Most organizations, this is what their actually access controls looks like. And simply an attacker can come in and replicate, as I mentioned earlier that I did with the ship management company. I just embed myself in the existing traffic and actually hide within no one traffic the organization. If you actually, with privileged access management, what we do is we move Active Directory to the side and we put a vault in its place. And what you end up doing is internal users can then authenticate. You can use a multi-factor, you can use peer reviews, you can other security controls, proximity, you can use keys in the systems that allows you then access the systems that you require access. So additional levels of audit, additional levels of monitoring, ultimately make it more difficult for a bad actor to gain access to those systems. And at the end of the day, these people don't know the credentials to those systems. They're being elevated or they're being launched or they're being brokered into those systems. And the actual passwords is not here and not written on a piece of paper. It's actually in the authentication security controls that they use to verify and validate access. So ultimately, one of the things, I did write the book, so I have authored the book about privileged account management. So we are interested in getting a copy. We do have digital versions and we do have some at our booth that's outside. But it is a very interesting read and it will actually prepare you to make my job more difficult. I want you to make my job more difficult, and that's my goal, is to make me have more challenges, to make me think of those things outside the box, to try and think of other unique ways to gain access and to go beyond the borders of security. And if there's one thing that I can leave with you today, one message that I think that if anyone was to take away that would make one difference, is make sure that your employees, your peers, your family, your kids, your parents are not afraid to ask for advice. Make sure that you're their go-to person when they have questions over whether they clicked on something wrong, whether they uploaded something that they shouldn't have. Make sure they're not afraid. Empower your employees, empower your family, empower the people around you to make sure that they're willing enough to come up to you and say, I may have done something, what do I do to remediate it? Because if you solve it at that time, it's an incident. If you wait a week or two, it could be a catastrophe. So the clear message is make sure, don't be afraid to ask for advice. And again, a secure internet starts with you. Make the people around you more secure will actually make you more secure. So I'll open up for questions. And at that point, I think if we shut off the record.